All right, we have a lot to cover for you today. And without further ado, we want to go ahead and kick this webinar off. By way of quick introductions, my name is Charles Ross, and I'm Tanium's Chief Customer Officer here at Tanium. Been here about 8 years, and I have the pleasure of being the host and MC for today's webinar today. So first and foremost, Happy New Year for folks who I haven't had a chance to connect with officially. We were very excited to have an opportunity to spend about 30 minutes with you today to get you up to speed on the latest on Log4j. We know that this has been a very significant event in our lives and in the daily work that you've had. And I'm sure you're in the midst, as many of us are, of just trying to kind of understand it and get organized. But we're also in the mode of looking ahead and recognizing that Log4j is not a one-time, once in a blue moon event. But we believe that Log4j really represents what we're beginning to see as a series of very common supply chain level vulnerabilities that we expect we're going to see more and more of over time. And when you really look at Log4j, what you're recognizing is happening is really a structural issue. This is one of many thousands, probably millions of unheralded, undocumented pieces of code that's being used ubiquitously across applications. And when a vulnerability like this comes out, there's a different level of effort, a different level of tools, and a different approach to really being able to mitigate it effectively over the course of an enterprise. So we brought some experts with you today. We want to share with you what we've learned, but we also want to take with it a lens to look forward to the future on how we handle these kinds of threats going forward. For folks that are new to Tanium, we welcome you to this call. Tanium is a platform for real-time visibility and control across all your IT assets. So we cover everything from IoT to OT to containers to virtualization to cloud to traditional assets. And when a Log4j kind of event arises, the area that we really focus in on within the platform is around areas such as threat hunting and risk and compliance management. And we're going to share with you kind of how that looks inside of the product as well. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce my guests that have joined me on this call today. Chris Hollenbach, who's our Chief Information Security Officer at Tanium. Melissa Bishoping, who's our Endpoint Security Research Specialist. And Jim Kelly, who's Vice President of Endpoint Security. So our agenda that we've got for you today is really straight to the point, get you up to speed on the latest on what we know on Log4j. And then we want to pivot and start talking about proactively addressing supply chain risk. And we'll give you a demo on Tanium and kind of how we're approaching that inside the tool itself. And then at the end, we're going to save some time for Q&A. So if you've got questions along the way, feel free to post those into the Q&A chat window. And when we get to the end, we'll go ahead and bring those forward, or we'll try to address them as the call goes forward as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our first presenter, Chris. The floor is all yours.
All right, thank you, Charles. So for those who somehow have missed the news, Log4j is a vulnerability involving a Java library to enable handling of logs and output from any number of products. And it is embedded pretty much everywhere that you could imagine, in a lot of places that perhaps you've never thought of. And that's led to the challenge of how do you find this thing, since it's embedded in other software, it's distributed with other programs. You can't see it just by listing the software that's on your system and know that you have this issue in your environment. So that's the first aspect. The other is that the severity of the issue. It is a 10 out of 10 when we talk about a vulnerability risk score. So the most severe type of vulnerability there is. So this led to a lot of organizations to scramble to try and figure out how they are going to find this in their environments, and then how they're going to then begin to remediate it, or at least mitigate it in some cases, because sometimes you can't immediately fix the problem, but you need to put some safeguards around that system to make it less likely to be exploited going forward. So this is a supply chain issue. It is one that we have seen many times before in different forms. And that's really the thrust of what we really want to talk about today. So we'll talk a little bit about Log4j. Vulnerabilities like this do happen often, and they're increasing in frequency and how they're happening. But then also what we're seeing is adversaries stepping up their activity around these things. They're getting quicker to get exploits out there. There was even discussions within the earliest days of this thing with people refining the exploits openly online. And we've seen both nation state actors exploit this as well as criminal actors with ransomware gangs and things of that sort. So that's what ups the urgency with responding to these events. You have to get the answer quickly. You have to be able to remediate systems or at least mitigate them and protect them until you can remediate them fully. The issue now is, okay, we're done with Log4j. We're not. It's going to keep happening even with Log4j because there's going to be software that might get installed accidentally tomorrow in your environment that reinstalls a vulnerable version of Log4j. There's new vulnerabilities being found in Log4j all the time. As you can see across your screen, there's at least 4 CVEs now associated with Log4j, and that keeps growing. That list will keep growing just for that one library. But there's going to be new libraries. There's going to be new projects and new dependencies that are kind of hidden from most of us that are going to have vulnerabilities in them. And how we respond to them is going to differ. It's not going to be always the same way each time we look for a problem. When we dealt with SolarWinds, that was a supply chain attack. We could look for a discrete binary on the file system, match up the file name, match up the hash for it, and find it very readily, very quickly, and remediate that. Log4j comes along. Things are a little bit more complex. Where do we find it? How do we dig inside of compressed files like zip files and jars and all these things to find it? And we're going to see similar types of problems with other supply chain related vulnerabilities going forward. So what does that mean for us? We have to have flexibility in how we approach these problems. And if we can move on to the next slide, we'll talk about that. Realistically, we're never going to stop all of the problems. That's just reality. So what do? We have to be prepared with our environment instrumented in a way that gives us the flexibility we need to be able to react to whatever the next problem is that comes along. So if we put in purpose-built tools that only react to the current problem, we address the current problem, but then we have to do the same fire drill all over again to deploy another tool to go search out the new problem for whatever that is the next day. Ideally, what you want in your environment is something that is instrumented in a way that allows you to gather data quickly and then begin to assess and then develop a plan around that. If it is something very straightforward, where you have specific indicators that you can look for a hash of some file, for example, or a string or some piece of text, or maybe in some cases you might get lucky and it is really as simple as looking at the list of installed applications in your environment and comparing to see whether you have that issue. Our asset module, things of that sort, help you to address that. Reveal, which is what we've been talking about largely for using to find Log4j embedded deeper into a system. And then using things like deploy to push out new versions of software to remediate those actual problems. Comply is going to help you out with finding whether or not you have vulnerable versions, maybe even tweaking some configurations to do some aspects of hardening, or at least identifying those issues so that you can then go harden. And then importantly, what about the machine you missed? Because despite working quickly, the attackers were faster. They got onto a system. You need ways of detecting whether or not they got there before you did. And that's where threat response comes in to identify those signs of exploitation. Realistically, it's all about having the infrastructure in place so that you don't have to scramble each and every time for one of these incidents. It becomes more of a routine muscle memory for your organization. So that's where I want to pivot now, is to Melissa and Jim to talk about how we start to leverage that platform and that flexibility to respond to these events.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So now that you've been through this Log4j scenario, and if you deployed Tanium and you had Reveal in your environment, you've already got that framework established to give you the flexibility to go out and quickly identify those issues. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. So the next time that a headline hits for something like, an NPM package vulnerability, struts, Log4j, or even something that is a trusted third-party software solution you use that has a supply chain vulnerability itself, you'll be able to leverage the Tanium platform to identify it. In Tanium Reveal, we can look for indicators of the vulnerability going layers deep into those dependencies, regardless of whether or not the application is even running at the time. By having Reveal in your environment, you're not going to be relying on a custom script that you wrote or something you found on GitHub, because those can have, those quickly developed tools can sometimes have performance impacts or unexpected outcomes on your endpoints. And while it's urgent to address, you definitely don't want to cause an outage. So with Reveal, you get a trusted, tested, reliable method to scan your environment and go layers deep into things like these jars. Which goes a step beyond looking just for the symptoms of the vulnerability and looks for the actual presence of the vulnerable dependency itself. So here we have several findings that Reveal has hit on. I'm going to move my cat out of the way. Sorry about that. Here, Reveal has hit on several different jars within this endpoint. Your analyst at this point would look and see, hey, these are all related to Splunk. And it's important to note that not every file that got a hit is titled Log4j core. We're not relying on a file name here. We're actually looking at what's inside the file to look for evidence of the specific versions and those dependencies being loaded. So at this point, the analyst would likely go and research the vendor's documentation and guidance and do some preparation with the business owners to identify, can this be upgraded? How is this being used? And it really does become a proactive hunt scenario, not just am I vulnerable or not? You have to, with these kind of vulnerabilities, especially for business critical applications, you have to engage those multifunctional teams to be able to understand the best path forward for mitigation in the meantime and prioritizing remediation. In some cases with vulnerabilities like this, it's not as simple as, do I have this vulnerable version or this vulnerable dependency? You're actually going to be looking at a collection of different variables. And in some cases, that might be running ports or running services or specific environmental variables, registry keys. And it can be complex to identify not only is this installed, but do all these other criteria exist that make me vulnerable or not vulnerable? So here I have pasted in a question that I wrote that looks for all the systems based on their operating system, whether or not the port is listening, and whether or not the service is actually running. And so you can start getting details back with these comprehensive questions to help you narrow the scope of systems that where it may be sitting on disk and you definitely need to go and remove that vulnerability from your environment. If it's not initially exposed and initially vulnerable, that may be a lower priority. So this would allow you to then build a report or tag these machines for further investigation.
Melissa, on that,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, that we encountered this internally as well. You'll have instances where you'll find Log4j on disk. And then when we checked with the particular vendor, they said, look, if you haven't specifically configured this, that, and the other thing, you're fine. In fact, you're actually safe to remove that file in that case. And that's what we did. For those systems that we found it, we didn't immediately panic. We went through the next step to say, are we actually using it? Are we configured to leverage that code? And if the answer is no, we have a very different stacking of our resources.
Absolutely. And I think this is an important point as well. While you're doing these investigations, being able to build these kind of saved questions, build dashboards, build reports and things like trends, and being able to have that aggregated real-time information for not only your online devices right now, but also the historical context of what's been happening as you've tracked your overall progress is critical to being able to target your engineering teams most effectively.
Yeah, and I think that's a great conversation. And Chris, to kind of go back a bit, one of the pieces of information that our customers gave us as we kind of showed Reveal as a tool to go through this is they were seeing many results show up in that list. The goal of using Reveal in this case isn't necessarily to go back and dig in and learn a new workflow and kind of figure out how to use this. It's really to use Reveal in this scenario to identify the servers and the applications that are at risk that you need to investigate. It was never intended that you go through the 22,000 lists of files on this specific server, but as you can see in the right hand side, we get a clear indicator of the directory structure that's in, the application potentially where it is, things that give us an identifying characteristic that we can then go back and either make an informed conversation with our vendor or with our internal staff that wrote that software to know exactly what you talked about, Chris, the implication of, is this just on disk? Is it actually in use? Is it something that had a specific vulnerability only if it was configured in a very explicit way?
And even here, I've got an example where, Ghidra is an application that doesn't even show up as an installed application, but would be stored on disk. And if you're running a scanner against your environment, fuzzing for signs of the vulnerability or signs of exploitability, if the application isn't actively listening on a port that you're targeting at the time that you're running the scan, you're going to miss that. Reveal is able to find these files even when they're sitting dormant on the disk. And, you still want to be able to go out and remediate those and get those upgraded because eventually they will be run. It also exposes the potential for shadow IT. Is this an application you knew was running in your environment at all? And so there's multiple benefits to being able to track this stuff down.
Yeah, that's fair. Melissa, one more thing on this, and something you said reminded me. Another piece of feedback that our customers have given us on this is that those custom scripts, those things they pulled off of GitHub repos and things that they built themselves, are point in time solutions. You're having to run those manually. You're having to take a performance hit on those endpoints. Crawling a disk subsystem to look for these things in a scripted way like that takes CPU, it takes disk IO, it could have performance impact on critical business applications and systems that you're running them on, where the solution that we have inside of Reveal, inside of Index, inside of Threat Response is categorically around throttling that information and being able to make sure that we're giving you that information without overdue pressure on your environment, so that, yes, we know this is an important issue, this is a critical vulnerability that's been released, but you also have mission critical applications that are running your business that we don't want you to necessarily crater because you're looking for something immediately. This gives you the ability to continue looking for those things without impacting performance too detrimentally on your environment, like you would running those scripts continuously.
Absolutely.
And on that, it's funny, people don't ever think about it at the time until they do it. But if you were to run a script across a whole bunch of systems that are all VMs, that are all talking to the same disk backend, and you're crawling them all at once, you could actually create more than just one system by that IO contention. So it's the scripts are straightforward and they look easy and they look simple to run until you run them in a real world environment. So you want to have tooling that takes that into account. When you launch scripts, you can play with that and do that if you have the knowledge and experience of your environment, but you don't want to be doing that in an emergency.
So another really powerful feature that a lot of customers have leveraged is the ability to use something like Tanium Asset and cross-referencing that with the findings that they're pulling out of Reveal for the software that they're finding vulnerable instances of things like Log4j in, but also being able to look at the guidance from CISA for their known list of affected software. You can build a custom report specifically targeting all of those software that are identified and their specific versions, and have a real-time living document for your entire estate, be them online or offline. And that's important because you want to be able to see when new systems, maybe they were built with a gold image, or maybe someone downloaded an old version of something that they had on a share drive. You want to be able to see when those things come back. This isn't something that just because you've uninstalled it or upgraded it once, you're good. You need a source of truth that is ongoing. And so this would allow you to look for, in this case, we were talking about Splunk, and be able to identify the systems themselves, and then maybe track down even the system owners or who's the primary user, and be able to work with those business units to develop your strategy for mitigation and remediation. So you've been able to leverage the quick searching capabilities in Reveal. You can build reports in Asset. You can do custom sensors to do these checks for these complex sort of scenarios where vulnerable and not vulnerable isn't a straightforward question, or be able to use comprehensive saved questions in Tanium to get the real-time information on the state of vulnerability. And going forward, you can update that third-party software with custom packages and Interact or using deploy. You can track the state of your remediation efforts with things like trends, Asset, and comply. And to what Chris said earlier, you can stay alert for signs of that post-exploitation activity using multiple types of intel sources in threat response. So I'll go back. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can go back into some dialogue.
Real quick question for you. There was a question posted during your demo, and it was around Reveal. And the question is, does Reveal scan for old kernels and inside compressed files as well?
So I can take that. Yes, Reveal has the ability to look inside of compressed files, and it has the flexibility to look for things that you want it to look for, either by keyword or using regex or any other number of capabilities we have there. It should give you the ability. I don't know exactly what you're looking for, so without having some specifics, I can't give you a solid answer, but I can tell you, yes, we do see inside those compressed files, we can find those artifacts just like we're doing for Log4j or with the other latest NPM with Colors.js or Faker.js, we're able to see those sorts of things as well.
Yeah. Cool. So I think we're going to now pivot over to some Q&A. So if you've got questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A window. I've got a few that I'm going to start things off with for the group here. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Log4j, and we just saw that demo. We also talked about how we've seen things like struts and NPM in the past and things like that. Why was Log4j so much different? Like, why did we have to kind of approach this one differently than the others?
Well, I think there's two different aspects to it. One was the ubiquity of it, how widespread it was across a lot of different OSs and platforms, and the severity of the issue itself. That's what was different. The reality is these types of embedded packages and embedded libraries have been an issue for a long time. We've known about this as an industry for a long time as being a problem. People really just haven't paid that much attention because they weren't as widespread or as serious of an issue. This was the first time where you really couldn't ignore it. You couldn't just leave it to your vulnerability management team to eventually chip it off their long list of things to do. You had to respond to this quickly. And I think that was it. It just grabbed everyone's attention finally. And now people are paying more attention to this problem and realizing it's not going away. We've got to address it.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things to kind of add in there, Chris, is that this wasn't as easy as just somebody giving us a binary, or we could go and look for hashes or whatever, because the vendor actually released the source code for this. So developers could actually incorporate that source code in. It changes the hash as soon as they make a change in the file. It's not an easy conversation just to go look for a SHA-256 or an MD5 throughout the organization, because you have to look for those other pieces of information that uniquely identify this inside of this. And not every vendor delivers a software bill of materials to tell you, hey, here's all of the things that we used when we built this particular software. So something like Reveal helps us to go kind of walk through all of those things to try to identify where it is actually in use.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, we've had some additional questions come in via Q&A. And maybe on that point, the next one asked, how or does Tanium Reveal scan files located on OneDrive?
So we don't scan network drives on purpose because of a lot of different performance problems, potential network traffic problems. If they are cached locally, however, and they are cached locally on that system itself, it will do that. There are other scenarios, other tools that if you need to scan inside of something like OneDrive actually in the cloud that will enable that. From a Reveal perspective, once those files are actually resident on disk and they've been brought locally, Reveal can see inside of those.
Okay. And we've had a couple more come in. I think this next one may also be for you. It says, how can Tanium help with post exploitation?
So I think that one is kind of an all of us that have been talking so far. With threat response, we have the ability to leverage multiple pieces of intel, OpenIOC documentation, which would allow us to leverage reputation or hashes really easily. We have the ability to leverage our own Tanium signals to look for post-exploitation. We've already seen a number of things where customers were reporting in that they've seen crypto miners being injected with the Log4j. We saw a notice in the industry just yesterday around PowerCharm being used as part of post-exploitation as well. So we have signals in the Tanium library that help to define some of that post-exploitation technique that could help in those scenarios. We also have the ability to use Yara rules to scan in multiple ways. So we have a very easy, very flexible platform to allow us to detect post-exploitation across the environment. And we have another one that is probably overlooked in many places, but Tanium Impact is really good at understanding the risk of your environment for lateral movement, credential hygiene, things of that nature, where you can simply go in. One of my favorites is to drop in our CISO's name into our internal structure for Impact, just to see where else his login could be potentially leveraged and used as something to traverse laterally into another system. Fortunately for us, we have a CISO that knows what's going on, so he's not into one of those risky places. But it's one of those things that I've seen in our customers that it's an eye-opening experience, because now you can see where those credentials are potentially at risk when you have a relational problem like a Log4j being used as initial attack vector. Where else am I vulnerable? And this can quickly tell you.
Jim, and another piece on threat response is the recorder itself. So think of it like a black box or a flight recorder. It's going to record process executions and where they talk to on the network. So part of the communications and the exploitation path for this vulnerability was to cause your machine to then reach out to pull down additional exploit code. Well, if your machine normally doesn't call out to the internet, you can look inside of the recorder data to see, oh, I've suddenly got network communications that it normally doesn't have. So you can start to piece together the other activity around that would be related to post-exploitation. So you don't have to just rely on specific threat intelligence. You can also go do deeper dives forensically to understand what's happening on that system using Tanium.
Yeah, and that's really important as we're talking about this new sort of era we're living in, where we have a lot more people working from home. You're not necessarily able to see this all hitting your central firewalls because we've got people everywhere. So something like our recorder, something like threat response allows us to see where things are reaching out into places that they probably shouldn't be, even if they're in a work from home environment.
Okay, we've got another question that's come in, and it asks, can you comment on, for zero-day issues, how customers build those questions or queries to focus down on where the real issue is? And they go on to say how much is reliant on query building knowledge and how much is supported by Tanium.
I'll take that one. So when a 0-day hits, there is a group of us here at Tanium that just pile onto those issues to understand the impact and to start understanding how we can evaluate environments. And so two ways you can approach this. If you go look at the documentation on the 0 days as they emerge, you'll usually start seeing people listing out the criteria, and you can pick that apart and start matching up Tanium queries that go with that. But here at Tanium, especially for these big 0 days, we have an emerging issues blog, which is on our Tanium community site. And that's where myself and a large number of other very smart people here at Tanium get together, and you'll see us build those saved questions for you. Sometimes we offer a custom sensor that you can import directly into your environment that we've tested at scale internally to make sure that will return an easy to understand, am I vulnerable or am I not vulnerable? You can also reach out directly with your TAM and coordinate with them if you're wanting to get into understanding the logic of some of the queries, and they're happy to support that effort as well.
Awesome.
Sorry,
it looks like we're right up on our time here, and I want to be mindful of everyone's giving us their time today to go over this. We do have some questions left in the Q&A. We'll get back to the individuals with their answers as well. But just to kind of put a wrapper on this conversation here today, I hope there's a couple of things that you'll take away from this conversation. Log4j is just the beginning. It's not the end. There's never going to be a done and then we move on. These types of vulnerabilities are not only here to stay, but they're going to continue to expand in terms of frequency and impact. So this is a new norm. It's not a fire drill. It's not a once every decade kind of event. It's something we have to be prepared for every day, every week, every month. We're very, very certain we're going to see more and more of these. There are too many of them out there yet to be discovered. Customers need a recurring process. You need to have a methodology in place in advance, not when the events happen. And we're obviously here to help you with building that approach and making sure you've got the right tooling and processes in place as well. And then finally, really at the end of the day, Tanium is here to give you that context, to give you that functionality, to give you that ability to respond. Visibility unlocks speed. We fully believe that, and we believe that we can get information that you're going to need regardless of the event, shape, size, scope. We know it's all going to come in different shapes and flavors, but we're very confident that we've got a very unique approach that's differentiated in the market, and we're here to help. So thank you so much for your time today. We wish you the best of luck, and please reach out if there's anything we can do to be of assistance. Thank you so much and appreciate you joining the webinar.